Welcome everyone to the third Europe in the World Research Colloquium. This is a new series of lectures instituted to inculcate intellectual community among all historians at the EUI, so professors, researchers, and of course Max Weber and other fellows who are physically located often in other parts of the Institute. Today we have the honor of welcoming Omer Bartov from Brown University in the US to give a paper. Born in Israel and educated at Tel Aviv University and then St. Anthony's College, Oxford, Omer Bartov is John P. Birkeland Distinguished Professor of European History and Professor of History and German Studies at Brown University in the US. He began his scholarly work with research on the Nazi indoctrination of the German Wehrmacht under the Third Reich and the crimes it committed during the war in the Eastern Front and the Soviet Union, which became the subject of two famous early books, The Eastern Front, 1941-45, and Hitler's Army. He then went on to study the links between the First World War and genocidal policies in World War II, as well as complex relationships between violence, representation, and identity in the 20th century. And this resulted in three more books, Murder in Our Midst, Mirrors of Destruction, and Germany's War in the Holocaust. His most recent book, Erased, Vanishing Traces of Jewish Galicia in Present-Day Ukraine, indicates a new direction in his research, and it's on the interethnic relations in the borderlands of Eastern Europe. The framework for this research was created in a multi-year collaborative project led by Omer Bartov at the Watson Center or Institute for International Studies on Borderlands, Ethnicity and Identity. Omer Bartov is working on a new book called Blood Brothers, Buchach Biography of a Town, which traces the origins of a local mass murder in the complexities of relations between different ethnic and religious groups over a long time span in the eastern Galician town of Buchach. And I think we're going to hear a bit about that backstory today. The commentator to my left is Jannis Panagiotidis, who studied Eastern European history and international relations at the University of Tübingen in Germany and also at the National University of Athens. And he took his Magister from the former in 2007 with a thesis on the resettlement of Greeks from the Soviet Union and Greece in the 1990s. Since 2007, Jannis is an EUI researcher here in this department, working on a dissertation on comparative co-ethnic migration to Germany and Israel between 48 and 92. And in the academic year of 2010-11, he was a Manfred Landstein Fellow at the Bucharest Institute for German History at the University of Haifa in Israel. Now, what we'll hear now is a paper from Professor Bartov, then the commentary from Jannis, then we'll move straight to questions from the floor, and at the end, Professor Bartov will have a chance to respond to you. So with that, over to you, Omer. You'll need to press the button at the bottom of this.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and thank you very much for hosting me here on this beautiful morning. What I will try to do today is to present to you some aspects of a book that I'm writing. In the background, what you will see is a series of slides. They will change every 50 seconds or so. They are related to the talk in a variety of ways. And I'm sure that all of you can make the links between the text and the images. But it is a kind of background second layer of information to this talk. So the lecture today, War and Genocide in Eastern Europe, External and Internal Violence in an Interethnic Community, 1914 to 1924, is part of a chapter in a book that I'm currently writing. The book that Professor Moses introduced to you, or mentioned, whose title has changed a little bit, but I won't go into that now. The chapter focuses on the relationship between wartime violence, occupation policies, and internal interethnic conflict in World War I in the East Galician town of Buchach. In another chapter, which I won't be presenting here, I analyze this issue in the context of World War II and the Holocaust. My main argument is that by closely examining events in a single East European town in the first part of the 20th century, we can better understand how the ideologies, policies, and actions of the regimes that occupied these regions also exacerbated and exploited local interethnic tension, so that there was a relationship between external forces coming from without and internal tensions. Between 1914 and the late 1940s, Eastern Europe was plunged into an unprecedented era of violence that entirely transformed its demographic and political landscape. What has recently been called in a well-known book, The Bloodlands, did not emerge, I argue, in 1933. The roots of murderous Stalinist and Nazi policies must be traced back to the upheaval of World War I. Nor can the horrific bloodletting of this era be ascribed only to Nazism and communism. The millions of military and civilian deaths of the Great War and the national and ideological struggles that followed it occurred long before most people had ever heard of Hitler and Stalin. Most crucially, the violence in this region was not only the consequence of external forces invading and imposing their will on relatively peaceful populations. It was in fact just as much generated from within, sometimes in cooperation with this or that occupying power, at other times in pursuit of independent goals and interests. Indeed, we cannot understand the origins, nature, and consequences of Eastern Europe's devastation without carefully examining it from within and from below, at the level of the interethnic communities that were wiped out in the process and then largely erased from memory. In what follows, I will focus on one site located in the heart of Eastern Europe's borderlands. I've been researching this town, Buchach, for many years, over 15 years now, and I'm now finally, I hope, writing a lengthy biography of its life and demise as an interethnic community. Buchach is known to have existed, and this is like many other towns in this region, as a town since the 14th century. By the 16th century, the town had a growing population of Jews who, along with Poles, made up most of the inhabitants. The countryside was populated mostly by peasants who were subsequently known as Ruthenians or Ukrainians. Devastated in the wars of the 17th century, Buchach was rebuilt and flourished under the Polish noble rule, really under one of the big Polish clans. It was a private town owned by the Potocki family. In 1772, this part of southeastern Poland was annexed by the Habsburg Empire and was given the name Galicia, or Galician, or Galicia. For its inhabitants, this was a period of relative personal security and gradual development, though the poverty of the province resulted in massive emigration to larger urban centers overseas. The last decades before the cataclysm of World War I saw the rise of nationalism. In retrospect, it was thought that the vast multi-ethnic empire, known by then as Austria-Hungary, was doomed to be torn apart from within by the competing forces of opposing nationalists. Yet the empire also found ways to negotiate with national movements, and precisely because of its own non-national nature, could diffuse the kind of radical nationalism that came to be so characteristic of many nation-states and national organizations which followed in its wake. In towns such as pre-1914 Buchach, nationalism did not necessarily mean conflict. It could also stand for improvement of literacy and education, for protecting one's religion and promoting economic progress, for celebrating folklore and recognizing diversity. To be sure, socioeconomic, ideological and religious differences carry the potential of resentment, fear, and hatred, all of which simmered under the facade of a well-regulated society and a prodigious, if not necessarily efficient, bureaucracy. Yet such tensions could have been channeled toward non-violent accommodation and adjustment. It was World War I that completely changed the rules of the game. And so I move now in more detail to World War I itself. Can everybody hear me, or is this? Yeah, okay. The war came to Buchach shortly after the outbreak of hostilities. An early Austrian-Hungarian drive into Russian Poland was countered by a major Russian offensive into Galicia, which routed the Austrian-Hungarian forces. By mid-September 1914, the Austrian forces were pushed back all the way to the Carpathians. Thus began a 9-month Russian occupation of Eastern Galicia. The losses incurred in these early weeks of fighting were immense. And I have to say that doing work on this period, I was struck by how little I personally knew about the devastation of World War I in that part of the world. We know much more about the Western Front. The Austro-Hungarians lost 1/3 casualties and 130,000 prisoners just in this short early fighting. The Russians lost 250,000 men and some 40,000 prisoners of war. Large numbers of Slavic conscripts in the ranks of the Austrian army deserted, and both armies lost some of their best trained soldiers and officers. The next few years would see both declining morale in the ranks and a greater brutalization of ill-trained and embittered troops. Buchach was swept into this fighting and the ensuing carnage, which replaced the collective memory of past massacres with fresh terror and trauma. Buchach was, as it had been since the early modern times, on the path of all invading armies. In World War I, it was more than once on the front lines, conquered time and again by one army or another, until little was left of what it had been but a memory of better times and a great deal of fear and rage, frustrated hopes, and lust for vengeance among its surviving inhabitants. Launched on May 1st, 1915, a 4-month German-Austrian offensive pushed the Russians out of much of Eastern Galicia. Buchach was liberated on September 2nd, 1915. But fierce battles continued along the Stripa River, which runs straight through Buchach, and this is a part of the front that was known as the Stripa Front. A massive Russian counterattack between late December 1915 and mid-January 1916 failed to dislodge the Austrians, costing no less, just in this little stretch of land, no less than 170,000 Russian casualties. I traveled in that valley of the Stripa Valley, and it's very hard to believe that so many people were killed there. It's a beautiful pastoral area. A massive Russian counterattack between late December 1915 and mid-January the soil of the Stripa Front surrounding Buchach was soaked in blood. Overall, the spring 1915 offensive cost 500,000 Austrian and 600,000 Russian casualties, not including prisoners. And then on June 4th, 1916, Russian General Brusilov launched a massive attack along a 300-mile front, which by late September reached the Carpathians and led to the reoccupation of much of Eastern Galicia. The offensive broke the back of the Austrian-Hungarian army, which lost some 750,000 men in casualties and 380,000 prisoners of war. Yet Russian losses, exceeding 1.4 million soldiers, were so devastating that the offensive eventually contributed to the disintegration of the army and the regime. Following a series of fierce battles, Buchach too changed hands on June 10, 1916. It was to remain under Russian rule for more than a year, so this was the second occupation of the town. Russian occupation. In March 1917, the Russian Revolution broke out, and German-Austrian troops suspended hostilities. A last effort to continue the war by Russian Minister of War in the provincial government, Alexander Kerensky, on July 1st, 1917, quickly fell apart, and an Austrian-German counterattack drove the Russians entirely out of Eastern Galicia, leading to the liberation of Buchach on July 26, 1917. And now I'm going to give you a few perspectives of how this transpired, more closely focused on the town of Buchach. The extraordinary military violence and bloodshed in Galicia left a long and bitter legacy for decades to come. This entailed, however, not only revulsion from war and all its horrors, but also a progressive brutalization of society, which split it into warring factions, ethnicities, nations, religions, and ideologies, and seemed to increasingly sweep away previous ethical compunctions and moral boundaries. The seeds of this internal violence were sown not only in the military conflict, but also through the devastation of civilian communities. The carte blanche given all too often to troops to loot and plunder, rape and kill, burn and wreck provided a terrifying precedent to all that was to follow. This was particularly evident in the conduct of the Russian army toward the Jewish population of Galicia. And no one portrayed this more vividly or with a better grasp of both Russia and the Jews than S. Semen or Shloime Zanvil Rapoport Ansky, known to us as the author, those who know anything about this, of the D-Book, which is a famous Yiddish play that was published right after World War I. He was, as I said, a playwright, an author, an ethnographer, and a chronicler of the devastation of Jewish Galicia in World War I, and of his own frantic efforts to both help its inhabitants and to record and preserve their rapidly vanishing culture. Ansky's chronicle, The Destruction of the Jews in Poland, Galicia, and Bukovina, was written in Yiddish and published posthumously in Vilna in 1920 to 1925. He interestingly wrote the diary during the war in Russian and then wrote the book based on the diary in Yiddish. And there are interesting reasons for that that have to do with complicated identities at that time. Official histories of World War I make no mention of the calamity that struck Eastern Galicia's million Jews, largely forgotten now only because of the even greater catastrophe of the Holocaust. Yet the war and the destruction of civilian populations, and most prominently the destruction of the Jews in areas occupied by the Russian army, were inextricably linked. Indeed, people's understanding of the war and of the role or fate of the Jews were causally connected. This connection was made not only by those who came from the outside, but also the population therein, be they Jewish, Ukrainian, or Polish. And once the link was made, it became an active agent in future perceptions and events, making for an intricate web of opinions and arguments, myths and rationalizations, commissions and omissions between local populations as well as between them and their various rulers and occupiers. As Ansky put it, I'm quoting, as soon as the World War broke out, dark clouds of terrifying libels and terrible persecutions gathered over the Jews of occupied Poland, Russia, and Galicia. For Ansky, from the very beginning of the war, Poles who came under Russian occupation blamed the Jews for disloyalty to their new occupiers. To be sure, the Jews who had lived under Austria-Hungary had indeed a great sense of loyalty to the Habsburgs. In Ansky's view, however, these, quote, allegations and libels had the evil intent of presenting the Jews as rebels against Russia and thus highlighting the loyalty and devotion of the Poles, end of quote. What is worse, argues Ansky, the hundreds of senseless and curious tales were accepted without any criticism, even by the senior army officers, let alone the lower-ranking soldiers in the Russian army. These libels grew like an avalanche and became increasingly terrifying. They spread into army camps, dispersed through the land, and whipped up a storm of rage and wrath against the Jews, even in those social circles which had been previously far from anti-Semitism. Most seriously, even the masses of soldiers, once they saw how the Jews were treated by the senior commanders, when they read and heard every day the terrible tales about the treason of the Jews, they too were filled with suspicion and deep hatred for the Jews. End of quote. Finally, this was the easiest way out, he argues, for incompetent officers. For, quote, every company commander, every colonel who failed could blame his failure, his incompetence and sloppiness on the Jewish spy who made everything kosher, he writes. Over time, observes Ansky, this became a mass phenomenon. Quote, in order to arrest a Jew, expel him, or hang him, there was no longer any need for specific accusations, for suspicion of welcoming a German or of espionage. It sufficed to have a Jewish name. Such mass violence against Jews, implies Ansky, was not always directly ordered, but was condoned and often indirectly encouraged by the higher authorities. It was not an expression of innate anti-Semitism by the troops, but a consequence of their officers' acceptance of rumors and allegations. That's his interpretation. Those whose interest it was to incite such pogroms were often motivated by goals extraneous or even opposed to those of the invading Russians. Nor was it a major feat to awaken a dormant anti-Jewish attitude among the larger ranks of the army and its superiors. Quote, in many towns and cities through which the Russian army passed, and especially the Cossacks, terrifyingly cruel pogroms occurred. They set fire and destroyed whole streets of Jewish residential areas. They robbed all the Jewish houses and their stores. They killed scores of Jews for no reason. They took revenge against the rest of the Jews, insulted them in the most crass manner, raped women, injured children. End of quote. And of course, the leadership of the army ended up, I'm quoting again, deporting eventually entire communities. This, he exclaims, was one of the darkest hours in the history of the Jews. Over 250,000, he writes, over 250,000 of Israel's manhood were fighting on the killing fields, that is, in the Russian army. Hundreds of cities and towns in the Jewish diaspora were destroyed in the heavy battles. And additionally, a flood of libels, pogroms, and persecutions inundated the Jews. Tens of thousands of refugees from the horrors of war, hundreds of thousands expelled, wandering without any protection. End of quote. Ansky himself entered Galicia on January 17, 1915. He rightly notes that although the Jews of Austria had full civil and political rights, quote, in the vehement and ceaseless national struggle between the various peoples which made up the kingdom, the Jews did not participate as a nation with a particular political inclination, but rather they lent their support at times to one people and at other times to another. This created a situation whereby each nation perceived the Jews as subservient to them and demanded from them loyalty and devotion. Since the Jews tended to follow those who actually ruled the land, all the other people were enraged with the Jews and saw them as traitors. End of quote. At the same time, claims Ansky, the Jews behaved with greater loyalty and consistency toward the empire than either the Poles or the Ruthenians, since no future nation-state would have been able to provide them with the same security as that soon-to-be discarded Empire of Nations. Now, Ansky briefly visited Buchach in early spring 1915. Abba Lev, a Jewish Russian soldier who also traveled in Galicia during both Russian occupations in World War I, wrote an essay based on his diary about his experiences for a volume published in Moscow and Leningrad in 1924. The essay includes a detailed account of Buchach after its occupation in June 1916. He basically came in right after the Cossack units had stormed the city. As I approached the city, I could feel the pungent smell of smoke and spirit. I could hardly breathe. The first thing I saw was a large wooden house on which I could still make out the Hebrew inscription, "This house is being kept by charitable funds." The burning house was a Jewish orphanage that the soldiers had set on fire in search of vodka. Lev then entered the synagogue, he writes, where I was stunned by the terrifying picture of destruction, vandalism, and cruelty. There he encountered a few terrified Jews. He writes, "They led me to a neighboring house where I saw a boy of about 10 years old, his hands broken, and next to him laid his mother, her skull smashed and her legs cut off. In the next house was a dead woman who had been raped and was then beaten so badly that she died the same day of terrible pain. In the third and fourth houses were raped Jewish women and young women, men with smashed heads and gouged eyes. In the hospice, I saw 5 murdered people. They also showed me many Jewish houses with dead people who had been strangled, burned, and so on. Next to all this, on the street, there were also injured people who had been beaten and raped." End of quote. Now, one must put this horror in context. We tend to think of this area as an area of a problem from hell, where there was always a great deal of violence. In towns such as Buchach, nothing of this kind had happened for centuries. We must imagine the effect that this license to beat, burn, rape, and murder had on the social environment of such Jewish communities. The violence of the immediate post-war period, during the Polish-Ukrainian struggle, the widespread pogroms that accompany these wars, and the Nazi genocide of the Jews in such places as Buchach and other towns in Galicia and elsewhere, including not least the ubiquitous phenomenon of local collaboration as well as self-generated anti-Jewish violence, must all be traced to such events, repeated 100-fold as the destruction of Buchach at the opening of the Brusilov offensive in June 1916. Now, unlike World War II, for which we have a wealth of information by local residents, and I have a very big part for the years of World War II in this town, in Buchach, and numerous contemporary documents and subsequent investigations and trial reports concerning events in such towns during the Soviet occupation of 39 and 41, and then the German occupation of 41 to 44. There's almost no record by locals of events in Buchach during World War I. Fortunately, however, an extraordinary unpublished diary by a Polish school teacher provides unrivaled insight into wartime Buchach. Antoni Szewiński, born in Lwów in 1858, was the director of the boys' school in Buchach before World War I. As he notes, his school was attended by 180 Jews and 120 Catholics. Buchach as a whole had a population of 8,000 Jews, 3,000 Poles, and 3,000 Ukrainians. In Szewiński's account of pre-World War I Buchach, the city was dominated by the Jews, who not only had more wealth and political power, but also enjoyed positive discrimination to the detriment of the Gentiles. This is what he writes in his diary. Indeed, Stravinsky can be described as a good representative of old-fashioned anti-Semitism, living side by side with the Jews, teaching their children, and by necessity, having daily communications with them, and at the same time feeling resentful about their apparent wealth, numerical preponderance, and political status. As the war broke out, dormant ethnic tensions quickly surfaced. When the recruits of the Polish Legion marched through Buchach, writes Stravinsky, the alleged Russophile reading room was energetically stoned and its windows broken. Meanwhile, he writes, the Jews put lights in all their windows and hoisted a black and yellow Austrian flag. That's the Austrian flag, right? They also called an assembly concerning the Jewish question, to which, quote, the leading representatives of the Poles and the Ukrainians received a special invitation, including Stravinsky. He writes, the room was full of Jews. From the podium spoke a little kaik, a Zhidek, in the Aramaic language, which he obviously didn't use, it was possibly Hebrew. After him spoke an attorney called Eisenberg in Polish, and called the Poles and the Ruthenians to help the Jews establish a legion of volunteers, of fighters, in order to fight side by side with the Polish legions and the Ruthenians against the Russians, and thus help everyone's fatherland. End of quote. This appeal for inter-ethnic solidarity was not reciprocated. As Stravinsky reports, quote, Mr. Chlebak, a professor at the gymnasium, responded by saying that the Jews in Poland never had it badly. The best evidence for this being the fact that today the Jews are the richest people in Poland. Therefore, they should also think and feel like Poles. The post office clerk, Siak, spoke to the Jews in Ukrainian in a similar vein, he says. Stravinsky's own response to Jewish attempts to participate in the defense of their town was sheer contempt. As the Russians approached Buchach, he writes, quote, I saw the kaiks, the Zhidi, marching, each and every one of them fat as a well-nourished ox, their snouts shining like lacquered lanterns. The stupid Jews thought that they could accomplish within one day what the Polish youth had been working their hearts out to accomplish for many years, meaning training. The courage of these fat, pig-headed Jews was already on display the following day. As the Jews heard the first shots, the entire crew fled to all corners of the earth, while those who stayed behind hid in the city in any dungeon they could find, from which they later emerged like rats and established a legion of dealers in stolen goods, traitors and denouncers, and always remained on the side of the strong. End of quote. Unlike the cowardly Jews, the Polish Legion of Buchach recruited some 60 youthful Polish volunteers, including Stravinsky's son Zygmunt, and marched through the city singing Boże Kość Polska, God Save Poland, and the Dąbrowski March, Poland is not yet lost, which later became the Polish national anthem. When the Russians entered the city, it turned out that 3 Austrian soldiers had been left behind. According to Stravinsky, one of them was a Jew who, quote, immediately took off his shirt and took an old piece of cloth out of his bag and put it on and walked out. The remaining 2, however, a Pole and a Ruthenian, pulled out their guns, shot at the Cossacks, were captured, tortured, and killed. Quote, they were the first 2 fighters who were buried in this field. Unfortunately, later, there were thousands, end of quote. But while Stravinsky glorifies these representatives of the 2 other ethnic groups in Galicia, the Poles and the Ukrainians, for Stravinsky, as for many other patriotic Poles, the war we know as World War I was, quote, from the beginning about Poland's victory, not Austria's. Within a few days of the Russians' arrival, scenes of arbitrary violence, destruction, plunder, and theft began multiplying. As Stravinsky writes, the city was full of Cossacks and Russians. The most unpleasant among them were, however, the Kuban Cossacks. When they encountered anyone on the street, especially a Jew, or a well-dressed Jewish woman, they would plunder them right there and then. There are also cases of mass gang rape, such as on Podhaitsky Street, where, quote, the Muscovites drove all the Jews out of the houses, leaving behind only the young and beautiful Jewish women. And partying, as he comments, was most jovial, since as soon as one group of soldiers left, another one came, end of quote. Following a Russian setback in the fighting further west, the Russians set about torching Buchach. The officer in charge targeted especially well-built Jewish houses in the center of the city. And meanwhile, everyone was looting the property. Quote, Ukrainians drove and walked from the suburbs and the nearby villages and plundered together with the Cossacks. And our Jews came with wagons and each took what fell into their hands. War, he wrote, awakens in people the basest instincts, end of quote. The commander of the gendarmerie, a Russified Pole, presided over a regime of corruption, theft, and robbery. This is all from Stravinsky. He was especially feared by the Jews, notes Stravinsky, quote, because he always walked around with a whip, and not a day went by without him punishing with it at least 2 Jews. Still, Stravinsky feels contempt for the Russians, not hatred. Although they, quote, could easily be bribed, these were honest people. One just had to reach their hearts. He also approves of their treatment of the Jews, quote, when any of them was caught, any of the Jews, black marketeering, he would be immediately brought to the administration offices and struck 15 times with a cudgel on the naked flesh, so that blood was running. Consequently, he writes, the Jews did their best to be at least a little honest. It is rather the Jews whom he finds truly pernicious. Under the Russians, writes Stravinsky, they gave, quote, the entire city a Russian look. Over the stores, they hanged huge signs and plaques with Russian letters. But when Buchach was liberated, from one minute to the next, the city took up a black and yellow look, and the store signs were once more written in German. And although Stravinsky, too, decided to escape from Buchach, as the Brusilov offensive was launched in June 1916, he found the fleeing Jews at the train station quite unbearable, as they, quote, pushed forward with a great deal of moaning and groaning and yelling into the train cars. The Germans, he relates, hit them with their sticks and shouted, "Move away, you damn Jews!" And the Jews responded, "We love our Kaiser so much." To which the Germans answered, "To hell with you and your love," and barred them from boarding, even as Stravinsky was offered a place together with the other fleeing dignitaries of the town. Buchach returned to Austrian rule in July 1917, but on November 1st, 1918, the West Ukrainian People's Republic, ZUNR, was proclaimed, and Buchach was once more under what Poles perceived as foreign rule, even as large numbers of Ruthenians or Western Ukrainians felt that for the first time since the fall of the Cossack state, they were in control of their own independent political entity. The Great War was over, but the inhabitants of Galicia faced yet another period of fighting and bloody massacres, in which fraternal conflict and communal violence often moved to the forefront. For Stravinsky, Ukrainian rule was akin to occupation by ignorant parents and bandits. He mocks the Ukrainian soldiers who, quote, positioned 2 machine guns with heroic courage next to the railroad and began to fire at the defenseless and quiet city, and later at night passed through the city just like the Chechens before them that from the Russian occupation, shot everywhere on the streets until they ran out of ammunition. Attempts to institute exclusive use of the Ukrainian language in offices and schools are seen by him as barbaric and much different from former practices by the Poles, who, quote, being a cultivated people, were never against the Ukrainian language. In the new schools, he writes, nothing sensible was taught. Everything was politicized, and therefore there were often fights between the students. Nevertheless, Stravinsky concludes that even among the Haidamics, that's a reference to peasant rebels already from the 18th century, there were decent men, just as the new Ukrainian commissar was, he says, a reasonable man. But when the Poles returned on June 3rd, 1919, what disgusted Stravinsky most was how quickly the Jews, quote, began to put over their businesses boards painted white and red, the Polish colors, giving the city a Polish face. In an instant, he exclaims, all the Jews forgot the Ukrainian language and began speaking only Polish. By July 1919, Eastern Galicia was under Polish control. As the Ukrainian People's Republic in Kiev was coming under pressure by the fledgling Red Army, Poland invaded Ukraine in April 1920, only to be pushed back to the gates of Warsaw in a Soviet counteroffensive that facilitated the creation of the short-lived Galician Soviet Socialist Republic in the eastern part of the province, which lasted only between July and September 1920. With the final defeat of the Red Army in August 1920, the Galician Soviet Socialist Republic was dismantled. Polish rule over Eastern Galicia was internationally recognized in March 1923, though Poland never fulfilled its commitment to establish Ukrainian autonomy there. The situation of the Jews in Poland, and most especially of Galicia, was the cause of some international concern in the aftermath of World War I. That was international concern and also debates over who should East Galicia go to. Should it go to Ukraine or go to Poland? Two commissions of inquiry were established with the goal of determining the true condition of this minority. This was not an easy task, since each side in the dispute had their own version of events, and members of these commissions were themselves under suspicion of being motivated by ethnic loyalty or anti-Semitic prejudice. The United States Commission was led by Henry Morgenthau, a prominent Jewish-American diplomat and former ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, and included among its members also the Jewish-British politician Sir Stuart Montague Samuel. It was dispatched to Poland by President Woodrow Wilson under pressure from Herbert Hoover, at the time head of the American Relief Administration. The Commission issued its report on October 3, 1918, in which it identified several massacres of Jews, notably in Pinsk and Lviv, leading to the murder of approximately 200 to 300 Jews. The report did not blame the higher Polish political and military authorities, suggested that some of the violence had to do with political factors, and avoided the term pogrom. Nevertheless, it suggested that, quote, these excesses were the result of a widespread anti-Semitic prejudice aggravated by the belief that the Jewish inhabitants were politically hostile to the Polish state, end of quote. The two non-Jewish members of the Commission, General Edgar Jadwin from the U.S. Corps of Engineers and Homer Johnson, professor of law at Case Western Reserve University, disagreed with the tone of Morgenthau's conclusion and submitted a minority report. In their view, Poland, quote, had always shown complete religious tolerance, and equal rights for all citizens had always been the permanent postulate of all parties. Conversely, quote, some representatives of the Jewish national movement refused to subordinate the Jewish question to the general needs of the Polish state, end of quote. The minority report further argued that anti-Semitic sentiments in the Polish public were rooted, quote, in the history and attitudes of the Jews, complicated by abnormal conditions produced by the war, end of quote. In other words, the Jews were largely to blame for anti-Jewish sentiments and attacks, according to this minority report. Seeking a conciliatory stance between these two polar positions, the New York Times published an article on January 21st, 1920, which described the Morgenthau report as, quote, a document of great value, both for its content and for the spirit in which it is written, praising the report as a, quote, impartial study of the bases of racial antagonism founded on painstaking search for the facts. The Times went on to remark that since another member of the committee submitted a minority report, it appears that the facts may be interpreted differently by various observers. Indeed, the paper leaned toward the minority report, pointedly noting that, quote, there were not thousands of victims, there were about 280, there were no pogroms in the true sense of the word. The number of the victims had to be contextualized. Poland last winter and spring was in a state of considerable turmoil, and many persons of all races lost their lives while the country was slowly settling into order. And since there was no attack upon the Jews inspired by the government or by reactionary organizations with the tacit consent of the government, these outrages could not be described as pogroms. Thus, having largely dismissed his conclusions, the Times lauded Morgenthau by saying little about responsibility for happenings of the past, preferring to point to both parties the necessity of cooperating in the future. Put differently, the paper saw the violence as an opportunity for reconciliation. This predilection to view reports of anti-Jewish violence as exaggerated and to interpret its manifestations as spontaneous and even understandable under the circumstances opened the way to a sense of impunity on one side and helplessness on the other. I'm going to move to the very last part. I won't talk about the second report, and I'm moving to a few diplomats' perspectives. The British government had other concerns for Eastern Europe, that is not concerns regarding the Jewish population, but regarding the relations between Poles and Ukrainians, the two majority populations in the region. These, of course, had a much greater bearing on British foreign policy and interests. The British government thus charged its embassy in Warsaw with making several inquiries of its own about the emerging new Polish state, especially in East Galicia, where the main concern, as I said, was not the condition of the Jews, but relations between Poles and Ukrainians. These observations highlighted the extent to which external and internal conflicts had become inextricably linked. In the process, that other major ethnic group in the region, the Jews, about 10% of the population, was reinvented as a minority whose position could never truly be acceptable to either of the warring parties. They could be ignored, tolerated, pitied, or evicted, but by the nature of the integral nationalism that evolved in this region, they could not be assimilated. This view was expressed most succinctly, perhaps, in spring 1924 by the Australian-born British consul to Warsaw, Sir Reginald Rex Leeper. Among moderate Poles, he wrote, there was a certain amount of reasonableness, that's a difficult word, but expressed in guarded terms, giving the impression that the extreme elements, who are invariably national democrats, somewhat terrorized their more reasonable compatriots. As for Ukrainians, Leeper concluded that, quote, the old scheme of autonomy was now out of date and desired by nobody, and that his interlocutors, quote, had lost all confidence in Polish promises. Leeper was reminded here of the case of Ireland. Leeper found that, quote, the Ukrainians had genuine grievances, and that all those institutions in which a young and somewhat aggressive nationalism takes much pride have been interfered with at one time or another by the Polish administrations. Yet he also observed that the Ukrainians themselves, I'm quoting, very often are obviously looking for trouble, and that many of the censored articles in their newspapers, for example, are frankly Bolshevik and subversive of all authority. What was the reason for this growing conflict? Lipa stressed that, quote, for centuries past, Poles and Ukrainians have lived together, and there is no valid reason why they should not do so in the future. And yet he found the temper of the National Democrat Pole and the temper of the Ukrainian intelligentsia equally exasperating. And though one's natural sympathies are with the bottom dog, he writes, I have a shrewd suspicion that, were the Ukrainian on top, his narrowness of intolerance would equal, if not surpass, that of the Polish National Democrats. He thus recommended the restoration of confidence. But one senses that he was at best skeptical about the chances of success. Moreover, he felt that any outside intervention would make things even worse. The Ukrainians, he wrote, difficult to talk to already, will become even more so. The reasonable elements in Warsaw, now undoubtedly getting the upper hand, will be silenced. This and other diplomatic reports had little, if anything, to say about the large Jewish population of Eastern Galicia, which has suffered more from violence in World War I and its aftermath than either of the two other ethnic groups of the region. The solution had to be found between Poles and Ukrainians. How that would affect the Jews was obviously a marginal issue to these diplomats. As for that conflict, while such sober reporting and evaluation was circulating through diplomatic channels, the situation on the ground, as you have seen from these photos, was far from sober, and military confrontation had already degenerated into wholesale massacre. This was gruesome, cruel, vindictive, and merciless violence between combatant groups of indigenous populations and against civilian inhabitants, who often were aligned with neither of the fighting groups. A Polish report submitted already in August 1919 provided a vivid description and photos of horrifying killings by Ukrainians. The same could have probably been compiled by Ukrainians. Although initially the Poles had the upper hand, the conflict simmered for the next couple of decades, only to explode with even greater ferocity when the circumstances of another external war allowed it. Jewish observers feared that this was a sign of things to come, which indeed it was. Now, all this happened long before Hitler came to power, and at a time when the Bolsheviks had had little impact in Galicia and Stalin was hardly a household name even in Russia. There are obvious links between the rise of totalitarianism and World War I. There are also important links between the violence we associate with murderous dictatorships and local conflicts, many of which were building up as a potential nationalist confrontation before World War I, and then erupted into tremendous violence in its course. Part of the nature of nationalism is that it tells its own narrative and denies other potential perspectives. It is not only that there are various ways of telling the story, Austrian, Russian, German, Polish, Ukrainian, and Jewish. It is also that the conflicting narratives about what happened determine to a significant extent what will happen. For it is the constant friction between them that propels them toward more conflict, bloodshed, misunderstanding, and denial, until the situation becomes simplified by the mass murder or removal of some groups and the assurance of complete dominance by others. It is only then that the conflicting narratives no longer determine lives or future conflict, but can at most make for interesting panels at historical conferences or lively debate on the pages of academic journals and the popular press of provincial towns. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Omer, for that very interesting talk that I have the pleasure and honor to comment on. I'll be brief about this, so and in order to proceed to the discussion afterwards more quickly, I will not give an extensive summary of the paper that you just heard. I'll just take what I think is the argument in a nutshell, namely what you said in the beginning, that the origins of the bloodlands have to be traced back to World War I. So, in other words, you see this violence of the Second World War not so much as imposed from the outside, unlike Tim Snyder, but as generated from within. And then you try to uncover the genealogy of this violence in World War I. So, what I think, while this is plausible and laudable, I think the connections that are made in this paper remain a bit too implicit in my view. So when you discuss Ansky, for example, which is page 5 in the paper, you establish the context of war, violence, the role and fate of the Jews, and the local perceptions, and speak of causal connections between all of this. But it still kind of remains unclear to me what exactly happened there on the ground. And I think the problem is that we hear different voices in this paper, like Ansky, Abalev, and Shevinsky, but it seems to me that Omer Bartov's voice is remarkably silent in many instances. And let me give you an example of what I mean. When you quote Ansky's analyses, there are many open questions and contradictions. For example, he says that the Poles accuse the Jews of disloyalty to the Russians, while presenting themselves as loyal to the Russians, which sounds a bit surprising as it is. But then Shevinsky depicts them as opportunists who sided with the Russians, while the Poles in fact fought the occupation. And there's another point in Ansky's analysis, or at that point I'm not quite sure if it's maybe your analysis, because there are no quotation marks, that the anti-Jewish violence by the troops, by the Russian troops, is not an expression of innate anti-Semitism, but at the same time it is said that that there are dormant anti-Jewish attitudes on the other hand, and I don't think you can have both, basically. So the point I'm trying to make is, if you let the contemporaries speak so freely as you do, which is very interesting because it gives a very vivid picture of events, you still need to add more of your own voice, I think, in order to help us make sense of these contradictions. Yeah, and I mean, in what follows then, when you talk about Abalev, I think there is more of your own voice. When the argument is made that the massacres perpetrated by the Russians had an effect on the surroundings, and that basically all the violence that followed in decades to come have to be traced back to these events. But again, it kind of remains implicit and leaves two open questions as I see. One is, how exactly did those experiences translate into later occurrences of violence? And two, I wonder why we should be so suspicious of a sudden and imported occurrence of violence in World War II, which I think we should, but why should we then basically buy into the same argument just for World War I, and with the Russians rather than the Nazis being the importers? And I mean, I think as well, there's sort of a simmering contradiction between this relatively idyllic description you give of pre-1914 Kakanian, if you will, and the dormant ethnic tensions that are quoted on the other hand. So that is a bit of a problem. And I don't think this problem is really resolved in these international and diplomatic perspectives. You know, to give us a better sense of the causal chains into the decades that follow. I mean, you didn't read out this bit, but on page 16 you have this juxtaposition of violence in World War I and World War II, which is striking on the one hand, but a juxtaposition per se doesn't really explain a causal link between the two. So in general, I think it would be good to hear a bit more how these two sections on the diplomats and the international context fit the overall argument, because that also remains a bit implicit, I think. And just a final and minor linguistic point, I was wondering if you can actually translate Židy as kajks, because I don't think in Polish it's a derogatory term, unlike in Russian. I mean, Žid would be the kajk, but the Žid in Polish is just a Jew. So even though the text you quote is clearly anti-Semitic, so there's no doubt about that, but Židek, yes, but you also then the Židy who are marching. Anyway, I think that's a minor point, and that's all I wanted to say about that paper.